Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a Cleo webinar leveraging APIs for real-time integrations with Cleo Integration Cloud. Most of you who are joining today are probably Cleo Integration Cloud customers, or you're in the middle of becoming a Cleo Integration Cloud customer. So today, what we're really going to do is we're really going to focus in on the API use cases. So instead of going through and giving an overview of CIC, we're going to start with the assumption that there's a baseline understanding of CIC just based on the demographic of the webinar attendees that we have here today. So presenters for today, my name is Tushar Patel. I am the CMO of Cleo. For those of you who've been around Cleo for a while, you may have seen my face, heard my name, or seen us at different webinars or different Cleo Connects. If I haven't had a chance to meet you, hopefully you can make it out to our next Cleo Connect event that's taking place in September. We're going to be doing a face-to-face event in Chicago, and it's always great. Well, we're going to actually have two different rooms with different tracks in them. So content that you see here today is representative of the type of content that you'll get. We also invite customers to come and speak about their use cases. We're also going to have some industry analysts and other folks outside of the Cleo ecosystem coming in as well. So hopefully we'll see you there. I also have with me Mr. Brian Cooper, who is our Director of Industry Solutions. Brian, introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Brian Cooper. I've been with Cleo a little over 8 years, but in the MFT B2B integration arena for almost 20 or so years now. I've been working with within the solutions team for the last, from Cleo's perspective, the last 8 years, but I've been working a lot with customers as they evolve in their journey through integration from not just EDI, but looking at APIs. So Tushar asked me to kind of talk about what I've seen from the last couple of years and work with customers, and happy to do it. So glad everybody could attend.
Fantastic. Well, we appreciate you, Brian. I know you've got a lot of things going on. In fact, I think you're actually traveling this week, so we were able to squeeze Brian in here as he's going from event to customer and back home. So thanks again for joining, and again, thanks everybody for your time today as well. We know everyone's busy, so we really appreciate you carving out an hour of your time to spend with myself and Brian today. So let's go through some agenda items, right? I always like to help level set in terms of what we're going to go through today so that everybody can follow along. Number one, I'll go through some housekeeping. We'll go in to talk about why API integrations in CSE, why do them at all? That's number one. And then we'll go into the different types of API integrations that you can do in CSE, along with some specific use cases that Brian's going to talk through. And some of those use cases are, I don't want to use the word theoretical, but these use cases are things that you can possibly do. So then we said, let's take it a step further and show you guys some actual specific examples and architectures of what customers are doing. So Brian is actually going to bring up some specific customer use cases. These are all anonymized because sometimes these are competitive situations and so forth, but this gives you an idea of what is not just possible with CIC, which we'll cover in the different types, but then what customers are actually doing. So these are well-deployed use cases that are out there today. So I'm really looking forward to that, because oftentimes I feel like we talk on an individual basis to customers, but then bringing that individual information out to a larger audience sometimes is a missed opportunity. So that's part of the goal today. And then any live Q&A. So as I go through housekeeping, let's talk about that. So we are not in a duplex situation here. So I can't hear you. You can scream at the top of your lungs if you want. You could yell at me. You could yell at Brian. And it might be therapy for you, but nobody will be able to hear you. So if you have any questions, go ahead and drop them into the Q&A. If you're not familiar with Zoom, there should be a Q&A box that you see depending on where your Zoom controls are. Go ahead and drop the Q&A in there. And then when we get to the end, we will cover those questions that we can. Typically on these webinars, we get a lot of questions, and so we're not going to be able to answer every single one of them. But what's nice is if you actually enter the question in there, it actually tells us who actually asked that question, so we can follow back up with you. Either your CSM, Brian himself, or one of our account executives will get back to you on any of those questions. So we do a pretty good job of circling through all the questions and make sure that we got those answered. So with that, let's go ahead and start talking a little bit about why APIs and CIC, right? Most companies come to Cleo and most projects with CIC typically start with an EDI project, right? I have a trading partner backlog. I've got this whole new ERP, so I'm rethinking how I'm doing all my integrations, or I have a new TMS and I'm rethinking, or my contract is up and I'm really upset with my current vendor not being able to provide something, or I'm just trying to modernize and go to the cloud. I had some homegrown system, or I'm using what we like to call legacy systems here, and you're trying to move to a more modern cloud system. And so, when we think about APIs, there's a couple things that we can't ignore in the market. And this is new research that recently came out, so I thought I'd share it, right? Number one, the average application that is being implemented by an enterprise has anywhere from 26 to 50 different APIs that you can utilize. Now, that doesn't mean you utilize all of them. Just because they're there doesn't necessarily mean you use them all. And Brian's going to talk a little bit about that. But APIs are becoming common. Before, if you look 10 years ago, 5 years ago even, most applications only had a handful of APIs. Now we're finding dozens and dozens of APIs that can be consumed. The second thing is organizations now are claiming, or 74% of the organizations that were surveyed are claiming that they are an API first organization. Now, very subjective, if we're being honest with ourselves. What does API first really mean? But what's interesting is the year before this survey was done, this was a survey that was done at the end of 24. The survey that was done in 2023, that number was 62%. So what you're finding is more and more organizations are thinking about APIs as a central piece of their overall technology strategy, their technology architecture. You're obviously all here because you're probably thinking about the same thing. And then last but not least, what's really interesting is 62% of the organizations said that the APIs that they were working on would actually generate income for their business, meaning that they are sitting in revenue generating transactions, right? We always think a lot about APIs as, well, I'm just moving data from this system to this system. What this tells me is more and more organizations are utilizing APIs for a B2B context, right? Where you are exchanging transactions with your ecosystem, with your supply chain, and there is actual money that is being moved or product that is being moved, versus just using an API like my team uses. We use APIs all the time to sync between different marketing systems to keep track of, for example, sending out webinar invites that you got, right? That was from one system that we sync with our Salesforce database. So like that is, what I would not call revenue generating in there, right? But a lot of what organizations are doing is more and more revenue generating actions with APIs. So super important. And again, you're all probably here because you are facing the same types of pressures or the same types of initiatives in your organization. So, and I promise you, I won't have a lot of slides. We'll get right into the meat here with Brian, but always good to set a little bit of context. So why API integration with CIC? What we've seen historically, and many of you have probably seen this diagram or seen some version of this diagram, is we've always seen organizations have just siloed technology and siloed way of doing things. They might have some homegrown stuff. They may have acquired a company that came with some solutions. They may have just done some one-off because they had a compressed timeline to get to market. So they said, well, let's just use XYZ solution and we'll just kind of patch it together. So you end up with a lot of different solutions to do different things. And so oftentimes we see organizations trying to do API-based integrations with just a whole host of different technologies or different components that they put together. With CIC, for those of you that have only been using CIC just for kind of like an EDI, or you're just like a managed services customer, we have designed CIC from the beginning to allow us to do API and EDI and even like unstructured data on one platform, right? Allowing you to also do that back office integration if needed, allowing you to do all of that automation and all of that orchestration that you need in order to run your business, whether that's an order to cash process, that's a load tender process, that's a procurement process. It doesn't really matter what the supply chain business process is. Our goal has always been to provide you end-to-end integration capabilities, as well as that real-time visibility for that. And the only way you can get real-time visibility into everything that you're doing is by looking at consolidating the appropriate API-based integrations and the appropriate EDI and unstructured data integrations all on a single platform. So that's kind of why you want to think about leveraging CIC for API, so that your other information that you're already using CIC for is sitting alongside these API-based integrations. And Brian will talk a little bit about this some more, but really what it comes down to is a single platform for everything that you are doing from an integration perspective. No one's going to argue the value of having a single pane of glass to go look at everything that's happening in your business. End-to-end supply chain operational visibility is one. Troubleshooting is the other. And then the other thing that we're seeing more and more of our customers utilize is our persona-based visibility. Remember, most of you work in and out of the cockpit, but what many customers aren't thinking about is that the cockpit can be personalized based on different roles in your organization. So cockpit isn't designed just for your developer or just for your technology teams. We have a lot of customers that are starting to use cockpit in their customer service organization. Their sales teams are sometimes utilizing cockpit as well. And so by putting your API-based integrations and your EDI integrations all on CIC allows you to empower other organizations outside of the IT department for the visibility that they need. No longer will they need to come to you to figure out what the heck happened to my order, where's my load, and so on and so forth. So with that, I'm going to allow Brian to share his screen so that way he can control the slides. And he's going to talk a little bit about API integration types that we see in CIC, and then dig into the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Tushar. Okay, so as Tushar kind of alluded to, there's some constructs around APIs that I just wanted to kind of clear up to start with. So there's kind of two flavors, right? There's the provider, meaning we can stand up an API that someone else can consume. And then there's the consumer, meaning we, Cleo, can be someone that goes out and connects to someone else's provider. So in the use cases, you'll see, different little API gears and arrows that kind of explain directionality. And so we'll be a consumer in some cases and a provider in others. It just really depends on which way the business is going or which type of flow we're trying to work with. To one of Tushar's earlier points, right, about when an API is sort of appropriate, so to speak, we don't foresee any sort of scenario in which EDI goes away. So there's going to be some sort of amalgamation between documents and information being exchanged in particular ways. And the reason for that is because there's just certain aspects of, different types of transactions that would be more commercial in nature, like a purchase order or an invoice. You'd want some level of confirmation more than a 200 OK. Which is kind of a response you get back from a provider sometimes. Maybe there's not enough detail in that to reconcile your books or really get an understanding that that was actually accepted by the backend system, which is where the AS2 and the MDN comes into play, like the receipt, as well as the 997 from a functional acknowledgement perspective, meaning not only did the file get delivered, but also we've accepted it in the backend system and it's being processed. So the concept of the API in conjunction with EDI makes a lot of sense. And the beauty, like Tushar mentioned, the beauty of it is that you can see both of those transactions the same way in CIC. So you can get the same level of detail from a cockpit perspective in an API transaction or a flow of transactions, whether it be an inbound order, an outbound order acknowledgement, and then maybe there's APIs as it tumbles through to the WMS. Or if you look at it from a logistics perspective, usually a 204 and a 990 could be more EDI-ish, but I've seen some folks recently start to look at only providing status updates when someone comes and requests them, as opposed to just pushing them out. So there's a provider component that lives inside of CIC where for customers that only want certain events, they can come and ask for them instead of having to redesign a flow. They can just come and make a request and say, give me the status of this particular load. So there's a lot of different ways to look at it. But again, the idea isn't to say that APIs are going to replace anything. I think it's just more meant to kind of think about not just, hey, can Cleo use APIs to connect to blah, blah, blah system? And the answer is usually yes. And when I get asked that question, typically my first question back is, well, what is it you're trying to do? And what is the data or the information that you're trying to get a hold of? And I've got some use cases that we'll talk about here in a little bit that have come up actually in the last couple of weeks that are intriguing and that they're nuanced to a degree, but they kind of articulate the power of the platform as people are expanding the usage from a Clio perspective. So it's pretty cool. Um, so EDI and API on the same platform really is kind of the normal gist. I'm not going to show any product today, but the idea is that as you think of the, if you're currently using only EDI, you'll see a cockpit tile with the EDI document number and any metadata about that. The the API function will work the exact same in that if Clio is a provider and someone connects and delivers a 204 or an 850 or whatever document it is, right, we'll create a tile with that information. And there's a lot of interesting things that people are looking at from that perspective. And then that all trickles down into kind of the troubleshooting and being able to manage that from a single perspective, being able to see where the errors are happening. It's not a black box again. It's not a separate system where I have APIs coming in one side and other stuff coming in over here. So if I'm trying to figure out where my orders are, I'm not looking at two different places. I can just look in one place and understand where everything's going. It seems to help folks out a lot. So if we look at, and so I've kind of broken it down into three different genres, if you will. So we've got manufacturing, which again, order to cash type scenario, where the order to cash process is pretty stagnant, right? You've got the normal 850s, the orders coming in, order acknowledgements, ASNs, invoices. A lot of that is pretty standard. And a lot of the use cases we see from a manufacturing perspective are primarily focused around usually e-commerce, where I need to go to Shopify or I need to connect to my 3PL and I need to push data to them because they're requesting or they're modernizing and don't want to support EDI because now they have an API platform. We'll talk about an inventory management use case where, where in order to reduce the short shipping that this particular customer was doing, they instantiated a inventory request API prior to an order being placed. So it's almost like a pre-order, like, hey, how much of this do you guys have for me, or how much is there available that I can order so that I don't order 1,000 when you only have 500 and I have to go find the other stuff. I'll just place the order and we can fill it in full, as opposed to having to come, you go back through the back and forth of, hey, I don't have it now, but I can send it later, right? All of those other gyrations. So instead of that, you can go through that sort of perspective. But when we start looking at how manufacturing kind of evolves from an API perspective, it really kind of dovetails into a bit of what wholesale or 3PL, warehousing distribution sort of flows are. And they're similar in some cases, where I may have a contract with a 3PL that's doing my warehousing. So as a manufacturer, I have a particular cadence with them on inventory request flows, and maybe that's done over EDI, maybe not. But I've seen a lot of 3PLs as they've kind of come along and evolved to have more API friendly WMSs that prefer APIs to EDI. So it's an interesting paradigm that we've seen recently. And again, all of this construct, right? So if you're a manufacturer and you're getting an order, right, it comes in your ERP and then it needs to go somewhere else, right? If it's a 3PL, now I got to take that order and I got to send a 940 to tell the 3PL to go ship this product in the warehouse. And then I need to get a replenishment report back and process in the ERP. And then, there's just a bunch of, it's a very elegant choreography of exchanges of information around how all that works internally. And usually it's, it could be human driven, where leveraging APIs, we can automate it to a degree, because CIC can know to, hey, let me get an inventory request or an inventory update from the 3PL via API, and I can pass it into the ERP so the ERP knows to ship more product already. So there's just a lot of different things. And I think to kind of tie off that is, if you're a manufacturer, you most likely have to put your products to market somehow, some way. You may have your own carrier network. You may have your own dedicated carriers. but most likely you've got some sort of logistics use case. So I think there's a lot of overlap and synergies between kind of the common use cases from a logistics perspective that are applicable or could be applicable in the future for manufacturers as they start to look at manufacturer-based TMSs, or as you add a module to your ERP to handle the shipping, and more of a consolidated effort. Because a lot of times we see, hey, once this gets into the ERP, how do I generate a shipment? Like, where does that go? What team does that go to? Oh, well, that's so and so over here. They go do all that. Well, then there's no visibility, right? I don't know where that is. It's a separate system. It flows a different way, but you could, in theory, leverage Clio to do all those things in a mix of EDI and API. So we'll talk a lot more about the logistics use cases, and that there's a lot of nuanced sort of ways people are leveraging APIs in the logistics and transportation space. So let's talk about some specific examples. So I've got a handful of manufacturing and a handful of logistics, and then I've got some more general sort of concepts that we've seen as companies modernize from an internal infrastructural perspective, that I want to talk about towards the end. So let's see what we can start with. So in this case, this is a more of a fairly common one that I've seen recently, not necessarily this specific, but hey, we need to get something in or out of Snowflake, and it needs to go somewhere else. So in this use case, right, we're calling Snowflake and we're pulling orders out, and it comes in a particular construct, right? It looks like a particular JSON payload. And in this case, we're taking that and putting it into Salesforce. So we're taking JSON structure 1 and turning it into JSON structure 2, and actually uh, calling the Salesforce APIs in the way that they're expecting it to be done, right? So that's more of as the integration engine, I have the capability to meet the applications where they are. So I can call and string together multiple sort of execution processes inside of a business process inside of the CIC that will allow me to do that, right? It's not just a one-to-one. I can say, hey, I got this file. I need to parse it for number of lines in the order. And for each line, I need to create a line in this order. But first, I have to call and create an order ID in Salesforce, because that's how they recognize all their things. And so in this entire flow, right? So all that kind of happens. So orders are coming in and it goes into Salesforce, and then back around to Oracle. Don't ask me why it is the way it is, but that's how they do it. But there's a logistics flow underneath, right? So the orders are coming in and they're being accepted, and now they have to ship it. So the outflow of EDI data to the carriers, there you have dedicated carriers in this case. So they want 204s, they don't want emails to ship product. So we're automating that logistics flow to allow for more accurate information, instead of having someone manually get emails and type it in and update some spreadsheet that people were managing on the back office side. So and again, you can have it managed service, you can have it self-service. It's really about the construct. So if people call me and say, hey, can we do this? It's like, sure, yeah, we can do it. But let's talk about why, or what is it we're trying to achieve here, so we can construct the flow in the right way. Because maybe I need to call multiple APIs, maybe I need to get other data or other information as part of this to support the flow that we need. So that's a fairly common one. Another really common one is, this is more of an evolutionary tale, but this is a manufacturer that started off with doing and solving, like Tushar mentioned, right? A lot of you guys here probably started with us solving an EDI problem. Wherever that came from, it is what it is, but you're doing EDI today with Clio in some shape, form, or fashion. And on the left-hand side of the screen, this is not meant to say they're doing both. It's just meant to say, hey, we could do it either way, right? API providers, or we can do it with file system integration through the agent. But it's that they evolved into saying, hey, I need to connect my 5 different Shopifys for 5 different regions, and I want a consolidated view. So an order in Shopify is just like an order in EDI from the business's perspective. It's still an order, but there's data that I need to get out of the ERP to put back into Shopify for it to be updated, whether it be inventory information, whether it be updates to product information, right? Whatever's going on the left-hand side, we're facilitating that entire engagement, not just X12 coming in from a purchase order to invoice perspective from an order to cash flow. we're also ingesting all of the e-commerce and and providing a consolidated view inside of the cockpit of their entire business from an order to cash perspective. And it's not to say that they couldn't have alternative e-commerce platforms other than Shopify. It could be Amazon, it could be Walmart, it could be any of the Target. You have to go through, I think, Channel Advisors or some other third party to get to Target, but all of that's possible in how the businesses are functioning. So you can add these different types of flows after you've started your EDI if you needed to expose a new channel. I was working with another customer that did something very similar where they're like, all right, we need to talk to Amazon. So we plugged in Amazon, and then very quickly thereafter, they're like, yeah, now the business, right? So this is the IT team we're talking to that supports EDI. The business is saying we need to be on Walmart as well. Okay, that's fine too, right? But because we already have the inbound order flow to the ERP, so we know what that looks like already. All we're doing is we're plugging in the construct or the schema of how the application wants to communicate. So how is what does the mechanism look like? So Cleo's going to call Shopify every however often you want to pull down the orders that have been placed in the last hour or 2 hours or 5 hours, right? Order to cash is slightly different, and you can consume it as you want, right? There's no real limit to it, but you don't need to call every 2 seconds and get orders, right? Because you're going to be wasting, APIs to get blank files back. But again, the idea is that you're able to, again, visualize all of it in the same cockpit and be able to generate reports and visualize and scorecard how your business is doing in one single spot. So if we look at the next use case, right, we're going to transition slightly into logistics. So again, this customer also started with and more of a primarily a low tender to invoice flow, but as a carrier or it was an asset-based brokerage, they had a homegrown TMS. So we had a handful of different ways we were getting data to parts of that TMS. And they had a brokerage business down there at the bottom using Aljax, but their customers were kind of a mixed bag of some wanted 214 status updates via EDI and AS2 or SFTP, and other customers did not. They wanted it through Project 44, FourKites, or MacroPoint, right? Those are our real-time transportation visibility platforms, the RTTVP platforms. So what we built was as part of this evolution, right? The outbound 214 flow the business process got augmented to take that same payload coming from the TMS and fork that data out to the visibility platform. So we didn't have to really change the methodology of how that data came out of the TMS and create a separate flow. We're just being able to provide a selection of, hey, for this customer, I want to route this data to Project 44. It needs to use this basically this connection information in this flow, right? So it's in addition to the X12. So a customer could theoretically get both if they wanted, but again, you could also have an API in this use case, right? Somewhere in the middle there, where, like I mentioned earlier, you could have a provider that sat there for the customers that didn't have Project 44 or FourKites and didn't care about every 15 minutes getting a 214. But they can make a request and call if they were technologically advanced to do that, right? If they had the capabilities and they had the developers to do that, you could provide them with that structure and the authentication to be able to pull down those status updates for those particular loads that they were using. So in kind of in an evolutionary case, this one is a little different, and it's actually quite interesting, right? So the external trading partners on the right-hand side are sending in EDI into Cleo, and Cleo is converting that into what you could consider a 204 to the TMS. So in this case, the TMS is then making a decision on whether or not it wants to accept it, reject it, or if it's accepted, do they want to keep it or do they want to route it to truckstop.com to put it on a load board and have somebody else do it? Either way, the TMS responds back over that blue box with a 990 as part of the response. So that's a synchronous API that says, hey, my inbound flow came in and now I've accepted it. Now I need to generate a 990 back to this trading partner because he's not API capable. So I get a response back from this system once I make this call I get a response and I convert it back into a 990 by combining the inbound 204 information with the accepted information from the TMS, and I create the 990 back to the trading partner. We can do the same sort of scenario for some older ERPs where we do what we call a kind of a turnaround rule, where the order comes in and we don't have to put all of the order information to get it all back to create the 855. We can still store some of that inside of Clio and provide that on the way out as part of the 855, where we're just getting the order accept or the load tender accept coming out. Now, at the same time, right now that the TMS has decided to potentially route this out to truckstop.com, now we're getting a separate call from their TMS to push a 204 payload to Clio that we convert into truckstop.com's format to post a load to the load board. And then we get a confirmation, we get confirmation information that that was posted successfully, and we feed that back into the TMS. So now the TMS is updated and has all its information. And then I don't remember what the cadence is, but every so often Clio calls truckstop.com and we say, oh, that load's been accepted. I need to go update the TMS. So we take that payload and we put it into the TMS. And once those updates come, right, we're fetching those updates and we're putting them in the TMS. And all the while, right, the trading partner is actually getting X12 coming from the TMS, that as the data comes in and updates, right, it's updating Clio via a REST API, but it's going out to the trading partner in X12. So it's really interesting to see how some of these constructs work around a lot of the logistics use cases like truckstop.com or DAT or some of the other partners that we have. If I kind of sort of deviate slightly, right? This is from a recent use case that we were working on, where the partner that we were working with, or the customer that we were working with, they needed to talk to Genosis Freight. So it's containerized information, or containers that are being shipped, and they're the shipper. So in order for them to leverage their TMS, Revenova, right, we needed to ingest the information. Genosis did not want to do EDI. They said, here, use our APIs to see the containers that you are supposed to be shipping, like use this information. So what we constructed was really a way to extract the information from Genosis, and we converted it into their same flow that goes to Revenova. And the same goes for the updates, right? It can go either direction, right? We can get the updates from Revenova and we post it to Genosis, or we can get additional container updates from Genosis and put it back in Revenova. But the idea behind a lot of it is, again, right, this customer evolved from doing just EDI with Clio to looking at multiple EDI use cases, not just with the TMS, but with these other external parties as their business evolves. And that I think is one of the key points, is as everyone kind of goes along their journey, that there's definitely times when it's like, well, can Clio do that? Yes, we can definitely do it. We just need to sit down and talk about the specifics of how that needs to work and design it in a way that makes sense, right? So it's not a question of if, it's just what makes the most sense. And maybe some of that is, alternate. And there's another one I'll talk about in a little bit, that is, I have to call 3 or 4 different APIs to combine all of the data that I need to make the entry into the backend system. But we'll talk about that in just a second. This one I think is really cool because I think it has really practical application for a lot of logistics brokerages. And that this is really more proof of delivery and bill of lading updates. So as a broker, I receive a 210 from my carrier, right, saying they've delivered the load. I just got an invoice. But in order for me to invoice my shipper, I need to have a proof of delivery and bill of lading. And a lot of carriers, as they get more technologically advanced, they're providing that information electronically via APIs, right? So I can get a payload with a base 64 encoded string in it that is essentially a PDF or a picture of the actual bill of lading and the proof of delivery. So what we've done is constructed a workflow that when a 210 is received, there's metadata inside the 210 that we turn around and we actually call the carrier's APIs that they provide, right? So we're a consumer at this point. So Clio calls the APIs and extracts the information, and then we convert it down into PDFs or whatever they are, TIFFs or GIFs or whatever they are. And we then hand those off to the TMS. So we have the 210, the actual EDI document that goes into the TMS after we convert it and we plug it in the TMS. And we have this ancillary documentation for the finance side for the accounts receivable and accounts payable team to go and validate against whatever the accessorial charges are, so that when the 210 goes out from the brokerage to the shipper, it's not rejected, right? So you're not having to pay your carrier and not get paid by your shipper because you got to go arbitrate over what sort of charges were there. So you have all the information. Here's what it is. So it's a really interesting use case that as carriers become more API friendly, I think a lot of people are going to start using this construct. So we do know about a lot of the different carriers APIs. It's just a matter of plugging it in, because not everybody's left-hand side of this flow is the same, but this is going to be pretty similar. So we can leverage a lot of that. If this is a use case is interesting, we can certainly have a deeper discussion. But the idea about this is really providing a reduction of manual process and chasing paper back and forth, to make sure that, hey, this document has more, we have all of the information, or we don't have all the information. I don't need to send an invoice yet. I don't have this information, because maybe the invoice gets generated and the proof of delivery and bill of lading aren't there yet. So CIC will hold the 210 information before it goes to the TMS until it has all of the carrier information before it sends it. So it allows for the TMS to not get bogged down and have a bunch of open items, or send out invoices to shippers that are going to get rejected. The next one is got the same piece, but it's also got a separate non-business flow to it, where as part of the inbound ingestion of the data coming from API-enabled carriers or EDI-enabled carriers, the TMS is a homegrown TMS that didn't have access to, validate the carriers as part of this. So what we were doing is we were looking at being able to make decisions, or provide information to make decisions on whether or not carriers should be allowed to take a load or not, where we're calling RMIS carrier 401. Some of the modern TMSs already have that plugged in, but in this case, they did not. So we were bridging a gap for the customer to being able to have a non-business flow that on a particular cadence, we would, go call these APIs and extract the information and create a format that the TMS could then use as part of its decision-making properties. All the while, for the carriers that were enabled to be able to send and receive documents in the format that they could support. So that's I think is, again, really one of those nuanced pieces where, man, it would be really great if we could get this information from carrier XYZ, or however this application, we really need that data here. We can, you can have Clio extract the information, right? Make an API call, pull that in, convert it to whatever format you need it to, and we can put it in the format that your backend needs and put it there so you can make those decisions.
Hey, Brian, real quick, you got a good question in here that might make sense to answer while you're on this slide if you want to go back. The question came back as saying, in these use cases where you're talking about carriers here on the right side of the slide,
Mhm.
are they exposing APIs to provide a proof of delivery, or are we doing something different there?
No, that's what they're doing, right? So it's a request for proof of delivery. So they've got the POD in their system, and they're not just sending it out via email, you're requesting it. So you make an API connection. Well, first you have to get you as the customer would then sign up to be a part of their APIs, right? You would authenticate, they give you a token and a client ID. And Clio would call their API on your behalf based on the information you got from them, and extract the information. So it would come with the invoice ID would be one of the criteria that we're looking up at the carrier from the carrier's API. And we would make that call and ingest it, right? And maybe we get 4 or 5 invoices at a time. We can string those API calls together to get all of them at once. So yeah, no, that's a great question. So yes, it is a carrier exposed API, not Cleo exposing an API to the carrier. I mean, you could, but most likely the carriers I think are really looking at, they have their own API, they have their own methodology of doing things. And you know, if you're going to use it, you're going to do it their way. So good question. Hopefully that answered it for you. In this case, this is actually pretty cool, I think, because it kind of shows some of the dynamics of how people are starting to evolve to use different applications for a specific purpose. Meaning, Turvo, the TMS in this case, this customer did not have did not want to use the financial side of Turvo, or it didn't have one, or they were already settled on Business Central. Not up for Brian or Cleo to decide, right? That's just how they were doing it. But there was an integration between Business Central and Turvo, where Turvo, the TMS, is providing shipment information that has occurred into D365, so that the finance team can generate invoices based on what's been shipped. So what we're doing in this flow is allowing for Turvo to be Turvo and be a TMS, and not have to figure out how to use the financial platform when we already have what we want for Business Central. So it feeds the data into Business Central, and then the finance team creates basically a webhook of sorts, right? They call Cleo's API and say, here's an invoice. And again, it's a relatively small payload where it's like, hey, Cleo, I need you to come back and gather this information from Business Central, and this information being, this is the invoice number, this is the shipment ID, this is the freight information, right? All of that stuff is in Business Central. So Cleo takes that payload, makes an API call, we ingest the data back into Cleo, and we convert it into a 210 with whatever additional pieces of information we need, and we send it out. And it's a pretty slick use case, because I've seen it a handful of other times, in that, hey, I like this piece of this application, but I really don't like this other one. I prefer this one. So as long as the two applications are there, we can make the same sort of choreography. And even if Turvo didn't have the freight information inside of Business Central, we could get it from Turvo. And we could still have the same sort of webhooky type scenario where, hey, I got this request from Business Central, I call Turvo, I get the information back, and then I create the 210 and move it on. So it's an interesting way to look at it, as far as how different applications begin to play in as organizations kind of move away from the more monolithic stack of, I have this legacy TMS or this legacy ERP that I've used for 20 years. It does a lot of stuff, and it's going to be a pain to move, but I really like this piece of this application and this piece of this application. Or maybe, hey, this ERP that we're using doesn't have a great WMS component, but we're looking to evolve to have our own WMS or our own TMS that we're going to use as part of our, our evolution. So there's just different ways to think about how APIs are falling into play on top of EDI use cases. So if I take a bit of a step back and think about how Cleo can be an API provider or a consumer, there's really two modalities from a Cleo perspective as to how you guys can consume it. So on the top flow, right, Cleo is only a provider. I have a provider that the customer will call and extract information, more commonly in the order to cash flow, right? Because it's not super time sensitive. It's not got a lot going on. It's like, I'm going to get my orders 3 times a day, and they need to go into the ERP. And then for the bottom flow on the top, right, the purple line, right, that's outbound communication, right? So that's 855s, 856s, 810s, right? So it's outbound flows. Cleo's still a provider. The customer is the consumer, and we have standards that we can use from a Cleo perspective that you can code to, right? You as the customer can use our standards that you can leverage to quickly integrate with Cleo. And then the rest of the picture, right, is the normal flow, right? Think of it as kind of abstracting the complexities from an EDI perspective, because every customer is slightly different. If we had a standard methodology between us and the customer, you guys, right? There's a way to do that. So that's one type of behavior. Then the bottom flow, there's a handful of others, right? Meaning that in this case, it's a little bit more of a event-based sort of integration, where on the blue flow, the top arrow, right? Cleo is a consumer and the customer is a provider, meaning you have your own API infrastructure, you have your own way of doing it. You may use our standard, you may not, but you have your provider that you've stood up, right? So you have people that have written an API provider that Clio is going to consume. So we push that data to you, right? So X12 to JSON to your API and whatever that integration looks like, right? I could use it in a couple different ways. One way is I may deliver that to the CIC agent and it drops the JSON payload and your application picks up the JSON and reads it and runs with it, right? It may not even be an API, but I've created a standard methodology of integration. And then on the way out, right, Clio is the three green lines, or we're three providers, right? So each document flow has its own sort of plumbing for an outbound document, regardless of industry, right? Regardless of the business process. And then there's the accelerators, which, you look at the Business Central, D365, NetSuite, SAP, those types of things. So the idea of how this behavior can be leveraged is starting to drive what I would say is kind of an application insulation on the customer side. So depending on how your internal applications are evolving and how your sort of IT roadmap and vision and strategy is, again, Clio can handle this a lot of different ways to prevent there being a lot of additional complexities from an onboarding perspective, so that I can take the X12 that is going to be varying from customer to customer to customer. And in this case, this is a 3PL, but it could be anybody, right? It could be a carrier, it could be a manufacturer, it could be a warehouse, it could be any of them. But the idea is that we were going to take the X12 on the way in and we'll convert it to a format that your backend applications are going to want to have. And we can, again, deliver it to them in the methodology that makes the most sense for that business process. It doesn't have to be a provider, it doesn't have to be a consumer. It's really more about what makes the most sense for that business process. If it's more real-time information, yes, I probably should push it to you, so you should have a provider. But if you can't, right, you can hit my provider and you can pull it in as often as you want. But the idea is to allow for the application layer to be almost agnostic, so that if you want to take your TMS and swap it out, or you want to change your ERP, right, we still have the standard format, right, in between Clio and the back end and your API layer over here on the right-hand side for you guys to be able to integrate. And then your team, right? Again, that it just depends on where everybody is from their perspective. But the idea of having more of a, a standard format, standard may be too strong of a word, but a decided upon format between, the integration layer, which allows for the complexities of X12 to stay on one side of the coin and to allow for a more standard integration pattern internally. So again, the idea, what we've seen is more of an evolution of sorts, that it's not just X12, it's not just API, it's a mixture. And as applications evolve, I guess one cautionary tale is, just because an application, and this is kind of a generic sense, right? Like any application, right? Just because an application says they have APIs doesn't necessarily mean the APIs may be as fully functional as their other integration methodologies. Meaning, like, for example, an Oracle may have a way to ingest invoices via an API, but the response back that I get is just yes or no. It's not why it failed, which is what my customer needs to know, why the invoice was rejected. So in which case I can't use that API to provide that data. So as far as migration is concerned, yes, it would be cool if we could use that API, but it's not functional enough for us to achieve the same outcome that we needed when we had an older integration methodology. So it's not to say that they don't have APIs, but what I try to do is I try to help make sure and articulate, hey, let's figure out the business process and the understanding of the entire flow of what we need to have before we decide what we're going to do. Because it may not be possible to get the same outcome as opposed to, like, maybe if I'm writing a file to a file system and I want to use the API for some reason, it may not be possible, right? The output and the response that I get may not be enough detail for me to continue on my process. So it's just an interesting way to kind of think about it. So I guess to summarize quickly, the APIs, again, from a Clio perspective, really start to kind of merge with EDI from a visibility perspective, where we're seeing folks use not just the cockpit for simply EDI transformation and seeing tiles and report generation and scorecarding, but it's weaving in the different business aspects, whether that be on the logistics side, updating real-time visibility platforms, connecting to other applications. There's a whole separate flow of, non-EDI type flows where, like, my TMS generates a load and I have an integration into Navix, which is more of an invoice reconciliation platform for carriers at a brokerage, where Clio is facilitating pulling data out of the TMS and converting it and inserting it into Navix, which is a, that platform where the carriers update their information, and the brokers accounts receivable, accounts payable folks make sure that all of the information is correct before the invoice gets put back to the TMS to generate the invoice to the shipper. So it's just a lot of different nuances. And we've started working with a lot of partners in and around the logistics space, and typically the integrations are via API. So it's not necessarily a EDI driven flow. It's an application or a business process where we're looking to reduce manual effort and reduce manual time in correcting actions or taking actions or providing updates to different things. We can automate that process as part of it, allowing for everyone to have visibility into all of this comings and goings of the data, whether that be X12 or API. So I think it's about 6 minutes till. So Tushar, I think, do we have, I
We have a
haven't,
ton of questions,
I,
a ton of them. So I'm going to give them to you rapid fire. I'm going to try to consolidate some of these questions because some of them are very, very similar. So the first question that came in is, what API use cases and document types do you commonly see? Do you have a recommendation for where we should start?
man, that's a good one. I guess if I was to, take that from a logistics perspective, I would say, I mean, there are some companies that believe that everybody should be able to do APIs, so they do all 4 documents from a load tender invoice perspective via API. You can post or, so that's one. Order to cash. I mean, there's folks that allow for ordering via API. So common 850, typically 855, not so much. 856, depending on how your customer relationship is. If they have the capability to receive an order, you can send an order via, or send an ASN out via REST, or JSON, right? Or XML, right? It could be JSON or XML. I think it would just really depend on it. Is your business doing it to meet someone else's need, or is someone requesting it of you? And that would kind of drive where the starting point would be, as far as what the requirements would be.
Yeah, and I talk to a lot of customers kind of post implementation when we do case studies, and we leverage their stories to describe to the world some of the progress they've made. And one of the ones that always comes up commonly in the manufacturing side is leveraging APIs to get their e-commerce and marketplaces integrated into the platform. It is a little bit different, right? As you go from just a B2B world to a B2C world or a B2B2C world. But we definitely see a lot more Shopify and a lot of Amazon, and then we're starting to see a lot of marketplaces like Houzz and Wayfair show up as well in the conversations that I'm having. Fantastic. Thanks, Brian. So the next question that came up is, here we go. So with EDI, Clio provides out-of-the-box process for creating cockpit tiles. How do we create the CSE tiles if we develop API, either consumer or provider projects?
So there are like just it's a great question. So there are non-EDI cockpit tiles that you can generate. There's a project in the SVN that you can pull down that has a bunch of different objects in it. There's not just cockpit tiles, but you can also generate air tiles with it as well. So depending on how the construct is, so if you're using the API flow, you can generate an air tile or a normal tile, but the behavior is quite similar. You adjust your cockpit rule set to use the different values inside of that particular non-EDI cockpit rule set. So if you've tried to do it, and I think if you're asking the question, it means you have tried to do it. There's an EDI cockpit tile rule set, and then there's a non-EDI cockpit tile rule set that is certainly lesser known, but it is definitely there. In fact, I just built one the other day for a prototype I'm working on where I'm receiving an inbound JSON that is actually a 204. I'm creating a custom cockpit tile for that based on the JSON payload that I'm receiving, and then it converts into application data for the TMS. So I have a non-EDI cockpit tile that lives and gets called as part of that business process.
Perfect. For whoever asked that question, we have it recorded here. So if you have any additional questions or you need help finding that, just go ahead and reach out to your CSM and we'll make sure and get that or drop a note into our newly created community. For those of you who aren't aware, if you go to our solution center, which has historically been where you post tickets and get documentation, we just launched a community about 2 weeks ago. So you can actually post that question in community and get actual answers from our support engineers, our services folks, our solutions team, and our engineering team. So just a quick plug on that as well. Okay, I got a couple of them in here. Just make sure that I ask them correctly here. So this is particularly back to your Salesforce example. I think it was a Snowflake, Salesforce, and Oracle example. When those internal APIs to Salesforce or Oracle, for example, fail, in parentheses, the order was not successfully created. Does CIC maintain those errors, or does each system have to maintain those failures and retry them or fix them?
So let's take one component of that, right? So the orders were successfully pulled out of Snowflake, and we've now converted it to it's a mid-business process, and we're converting it to a payload that's going to go to Salesforce. I try and call the Salesforce API, it's down. So inside of that flow and that business process, there's error handling that we would build in so that a retry mechanism would take place where it wouldn't just die and just disappear. So it wouldn't be a Salesforce problem theoretically, and that the API was down, that's a problem, but you could recover it from CIC and have reprocessing done there. And same sort of flow is from Oracle, right? If I was pulling data from Oracle, right, I made a call to Oracle and I couldn't reach it, right, I would retry that connection to Oracle. So the error handling would occur. I think in the context of error handling, right, you would, depending on how long you set that retry mechanism for, because it could live in process and it wouldn't necessarily go to failure yet, unless you wanted it to like try once and then fail. Like if it didn't make it, it's dead, so that you can retry it as fast as possible. But it could be constructed to basically, if I can't write it, I could write it to a table that is where the actual call goes to, right? So you can kind of maneuver the business process to use a different mechanism as opposed to like, all right, so I'm going to get the data out of Snowflake, I'm going to write it all to this table, and I'm going to call that good. And then I'm going to try this API call to Salesforce, and I'm going to read it out of this table. So if I can't read it out of the table, I leave it there. So every time I run the job to flush the table to inject all that data into Salesforce, I can mark it as complete. So when I check the table the next time, I could then see it go back into Salesforce once the API was back up.
So this is a little bit related to the error. And so the question that came in was, do you have a more robust API response instead of just a 200?
Yes.
Um, Okay, so I'll let you answer that. I think you understood what the question was.
Yeah, so you can construct your own response payloads. So again, there's different nuances of when you want to use an API, a synchronous API provider or a asynchronous API provider. But in either case, right, you can construct a message that goes back as part of the response inside of the provider itself. So I think that would, I mean, that's going to take a lot longer than we have to answer more of it, but the answer is yes. But like, just drop a note to the CSM and we can have a conversation. I'm happy to get on the phone and talk about it.
Perfect. That may be a little bit related as well, and this will probably be the last question, so apologies, folks. We got a lot more questions than I anticipated. We should have left more time for Q&A, but this gives you a reason to reach back out to your CSM and gives us a reason to maybe set up a little bit more of a focused, personalized conversation with you. So last question. Some of the use cases suggest flows where Cleo is orchestrating and running a long process. In cases where it is aggregating information that may occur at disparate times, is hosting long-running flows being able to hydrate? Does Cleo have the ability to host these long-running flows and be able to hydrate and revive those flows right out of the box? Sounds like if there's a holding pattern, right, where you take in information, kind of waiting for something, and you need to bring it together. Does CIC have a holding pattern or for some of those flows?
I, I, I think that the answer is it depends on how you construct the business process. So if the flow requires fetching information from multiple sources, then I wouldn't have it hold a connection and then fetch some more information. I would get the information, I'd write it to a temporary table, fetch information to, write it to a temporary, and maybe that takes 3 or 4 different times of the day to gather all the information, and then I take the whatever is left in that table, and then I create a response outbound, right? But again, the construct of the business process would need to be understood from a timing perspective for what the business use case was, and that's how we could allow for Cleo to kind of be gathering information, gathering more information. I've now got all the information I need, and now I can send it. And if I need to do that rapidly and say get, I can consolidate it all at once, and I do one get, and there's 3 different processes that get executed to create my consolidated flow. If I have information from 2 of the 3, I don't do anything. I wait, because the next time I may get all the other information that I need in my table, and then I can send the old one plus the new one, right? And I'm kind of whiteboarding in my head, but hopefully that helped.
Nope, totally makes sense. So we have a couple of questions here that are anonymous. The folks that entered questions with their name, we'll go and get back to. The anonymous folks is going to be almost impossible for us to get back to. So here's what I'm going to ask the folks that ask questions anonymously in the chat. Please take that question and drop it into the new community in the Solution Center, and that will allow the entire Cleo ecosystem basically to answer that question. So you can get answers from other customers. You might be able to get an answer from, like I said, a Cleo engineer. That community is open to anybody who has a login to the Solution Center. So if you don't have a login to the Solution Center, pretty easy to go request one and create one. Just go in there, create a new account, and allows you to have access. Brian Cooper, really appreciate you taking the time. Always a pleasure. Feels like it's been forever since you and I got to work on a project together. So thank you for doing that again. I know you've got to go because you are on the road. So you've got to hop, I think, in an Uber to get to your on-site meeting that you have. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the time today. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully we answered your question. If we didn't answer your question, like I said, we'll get back to you. Also go ahead and use that community. We will get out, there's a question that was asked. We will get out the recording. We will get out the slides to you here in the next couple of days. Since tomorrow's a Friday, we may not be able to get it to you done by end of day Friday. We typically don't like to send stuff on Friday because it gets lost here over the weekend. So we probably will send something out on Monday or Tuesday. So with that, thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day, and appreciate you taking the time to be with Brian and myself.
Thank you, guys. Looking forward to it.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.